Dynamic cruise control, cornering ABS, cornering traction control, dynamic headlights. No, I'm not talking about the latest iteration of the Panigale. What I'm talking about is this, the TVS Apache RTR 310. This, as you have probably guessed already, is the naked iteration of the RR 310, and it gets a bunch of changes apart from just its cosmetic looks. And what we're going to be finding out in this video today is exactly what those changes are and how they translate for you as the rider if you were to get this bike. Welcome to the Evo India YouTube channel and welcome to the first ride review of the RTR 310 right here from Bangkok in Thailand. Now, before I get into talking about how this bike rides, what the engine and the performance is like, what features it gets, I really think I need to address design because this is a striking motorcycle. It's got sharp cuts and creases, it looks aggressive, it's one of those bikes that looks fast even when it's standing still. And in fact, a lot of the elements of the design of this bike look like they're derivatives from Street Fighters from different parts of the world. In fact, it even looks like the Ducati Street Fighter in certain elements. If I point you towards this radiator guard, it looks pretty similar to the Ducati Street Fighters. And I am not complaining, it looks really good. But at the same time, it has all the elements that tie it to its other horse badge wearing brethren. Like you see the tank, you see these details over here, this front end, there is similarity with other bikes in its lineup. Even that exposed frame, you know this is a TVS. Now they have done a really good job of the styling and the color options that they have are also pretty nice. You have this grey and yellow color scheme. Then you have the Sepang edition color scheme, which is a nice blend of white, blue and a bit of red accenting. Then you have that, the grey and the black edition as well. So overall the color choices are pretty nice and the design of this bike is rather nice. It looks like a nice cohesive design with a bunch of elements that work really well for it. Now, with design out of the way, I know that wasn't a very comprehensive look at the design, but I think you can make out for yourself what you think of this design. Now let's get into the performance bits of this motorcycle. Now powering this is the same 312.12cc single cylinder liquid cooled dual overhead camshaft fitted motor, but the motor is not in the same state of tune as found on the RR 310. This now makes 35 bhp and 27.8 Newton meters of torque. That's roughly a Newton meter and a half and a bhp and a half more than it used to make on the RR 310. And the torque, it also comes in nearly 1050 RPM earlier. What that, along with the new final drive, the rear sprocket was a 42 teeth on the RR 310. Over here you have a 46 tooth rear sprocket. Now that, coupled with the newfound performance which comes from a forged piston, a larger airbox, a narrower air intake and a new tune for the exhaust, makes this bike a lot more punchier and peppier in the low and the mid range of the rev spectrum. Now that means it's snappier, it's more like a hooligan than the RR 310 ever was, and it feels a lot more exciting and engaging to ride when you're in that lower half of the rev range. But that does come at a cost. What this means is the gearing is pretty short. Now the gearbox in itself hasn't changed, but the change in that final drive has dramatically changed the way this bike feels in each gear, right from 1 to 6. Like I said, it's very easy to pop wheelies on this bike, even in first and second gear. But the top end does feel a bit compromised. Now I'm not talking about outright top speed, but the higher sprocket does mean that you need to keep the engine on the boil to really get all the power out of it. And there is also a bit of refinement issues. Now the refinement issues come in the sense that 6 to 7,000 RPM in 6th gear is where you'd be at if you were to cruise at say 100 kilometers per hour. 100 kilometers per hour in Indian highways is fair enough. You don't really want to be doing more than that on a bike of this capacity with this kind of brakes and chassis. But that is where the meat of the vibrations are, and that becomes a rather unpleasant experience when you want to cruise down comfortably at 100 kilometers per hour. So that is something that really needs to be rectified. Now TVS tells us that if you wanted to, you could go to the TVS showroom and opt for the smaller 42 tooth sprocket. But in all honesty, I can't tell you how that bike would perform with that sprocket setup, and that is not something that TVS will do for you right out of the factory. So this is something that you have to do after you get the bike. So do that carefully if you want to. Now in terms of the rest of the performance, very punchy from the low end, good mid-range, but not as potent in the top range, and that is honestly fine because this is a naked motorcycle. The primary of its usage is going to be in the city and on the highways, and maybe the occasional track day every now and then. But the touring bit is a bit compromised because of the vibrations at 6,000 RPM when you're cruising at 100. So that is one thing you need to take note of. But for the city, this bike feels great. Next up is the chassis, the ride and the handling. Now the essential base chassis is the same. So the main frame is still the same trolley frame that you find on the RR310. But this bike does get a new aluminum subframe, and it also gets slightly different rider ergonomics. Now this is a naked bike obviously, so you get a tall wide single piece handlebar instead of the clip-ons that you find on the RR310. So you're sat higher up, and the foot pegs, as TVS tells me, are pretty much the same height as they are on the RR310, but they're a little further ahead. What this means is we got to ride on the streets of Bangkok, and we also got to have a go at the Thailand circuit. What this means was there was a bit of cornering clearance issues because the foot pegs started to scrape sooner than they would on the RR310. But then again, that is not a deal breaker because this is not meant to be an out-and-out track bike. The RR310 still exists for that very reason. So in the city, the ergonomics are great. You're sat upright, your feet aren't all that far behind, and they aren't too high either. They're nice, it's a comfortable place to be. The seat is stiff, it's not too soft, it's not too hard, so it shouldn't be a problem for long distance touring. This is something we will verify once we get the bike for a road test, but our initial impressions from the 50-60 odd kilometer ride we had are fairly positive on that front. Now in terms of the suspension, you essentially get the same KYB upside down forks up front and the KYB monoshock at the rear, and the best part about this whole deal is you get the BTO kit right from the get-go. You don't need to wait for TVS to launch that eventually. This is there right from the launch. You can opt for the BTO kit, and what that means is if you spec the dynamic kit, you get adjustable suspension up front. The front is adjustable for everything, so you have compression, preload and rebound, whereas the rear you have rebound and preload, which is great. We've already tested this on the RR310. We've done a comprehensive video of the suspension of the RR310, so you already know how that is. In this bike, well, the roads in Thailand are significantly better than in India, so I can't really tell you exactly how this bike feels, but if the RR310 is any yardstick to go by, I think it's a safe bet assuming that this is going to be very similar in our roads, which means it should be plush, it should be compliant, but at the same time sporty and dynamic when you want it to be. There's tons of feedback, and that also comes down from these, because luckily for us, TVS is not skimping out on tires, and we still do get the Michelin Road 5s. I don't need to say much about those tires, you know how they are. They're grippy in the wet, they're grippy in the dry. Tremendous amounts of grip even when fully leaned over. Overall, a very good tire for someone who's looking for sporty riding and long distance touring at the same time. Now brakes, again, you have the same braking setup, but one good thing is that you get adjustable levers right from the factory. This is something even the RR310 with the BTO kit misses out on sorely. So that being here and the chunky lever feel is all well and good. In terms of handling, this is not your out and out track machine. It feels confident, it feels stable, it turns in quickly, but if track riding is what your sole focus is, you're better off with something like the RR310 if TVS is where you're looking at. So overall the riding experience was pretty good, but the engine was a bit of a letdown because of the vibes and the way it is geared. But then again, for the city, this is great. Next up are the features. I started off this video by saying things like cornering traction control, cornering ABS, dynamic cruise control, which includes cornering cruise control. You have dynamic headlights, dynamic tail lights, dynamic bunch of things, and you also have an extremely interesting feature, which is your seats, which are temperature controlled seats. So it can be cooled or you can make it hotter depending on where and how you're riding. Now everything is controlled by a neat 4-button switch cube layout that you have seen already on the RR310, and on the instrument cluster, 5-inch instrument cluster, which unlike the RR310 is mounted horizontally, not vertically. So there is that. Now you also have riding modes. You have track, you have sport, you have urban, you have rain, and you have a supermoto mode, which is sort of baked into the sport mode where it shuts off ABS to the rear, so you can be more of a hooligan if you want to. Now all of these electronics are enabled by a 6-axis IMU. Now this is not standard fitment. If you want to get this, you have to get something that's called the Dynamic Pro package. So that is a part of the Dynamic package which gives you the suspension and all of that. So now that 6-axis, like I said, it enables cornering ABS, cornering traction control, Cruise control is another addition to this bike, and cornering cruise control. How that works is essentially when you're going into a corner, the IMU senses that you're leaning the bike into a corner. It will automatically reduce the speed so that you're not changing your line too much, but at the same time you're not going in too hot into a corner. And what this essentially means is, in most other bikes that don't have this feature, you'll have to shut off cruise control, or rather cruise control will get shut off because you get off the throttle, get on the brake, and then you need to re-engage it. But this will do that for you. I've not tested this out, so I can't tell you how well it works, but I tested out the cruise control and it works as expected. The basic cruise control, it works as expected. So there is that. Cornering ABS, it's always good to have, especially with the way our roads are deteriorating right now. These are some safety features that you're always better off with. Traction control, again, let's not get into the argument of whether or not a 300cc bike needs traction control, but the fact that it's there and the fact that it is IMU enabled just makes you a more confident rider, knowing that the bike will take care of you. A more comprehensive, deeper dive into all the tech that this bike has will also be done later, because there's just a lot to unpack and we've not had enough time to figure out all these things. So there is that. So again, in terms of the spec sheet, in terms of the feature list, I don't really think there's any other bike that comes close to this in this segment. This really does stand a couple of segments higher in terms of what it has, in terms of its features. Even the headlights, like I said, they're dynamic. Now, what does that mean? Also, it is light and dark, that will sense that. Plus, it is also speed dependent. So the faster you go, the brighter the throw of the headlamp is supposed to get. Again, we never really rode in the dark, so I can't tell you how that functions. So that will be covered at a later date. Overall, the bike is a great package. The engine is the only thing that is holding it back slightly. The RR310 had come a long way from Gen 1 to what it is right now in terms of refinement. But this seems to be taking a step in a different direction in terms of refinement. Now, like I said, this changing the sprocket back to the 42 or maybe optioning a 44 may be an option, but that's not something TVS will do for you voluntarily. This is something you might have to go and ask them. But apart from that, this is a pretty capable bike. It's not as well-rounded as the RR310 in the sense that it won't be just as good a tourer, just as good a track bike, or just as good a city bike. Although this does feel like a much better city bike, but just that. So if you want an all-rounder, the RR310 is still the way to go. But if you want a hooligan, you want something that's crazy fun for the city, you can occasionally take to a track day and maybe do some touring on, this is a good option. If you want to get one, the price tag starts at Rs 2.43 lakh ex-showroom for that color scheme without the bi-directional quick shifter. Oh yes, this also gets a bi-directional quick shifter. If you want to go up from that, get the bi-directional quick shifter and get this color scheme, you're paying around 2.63 lakh ex-showroom. Then if you want to option the dynamic kit, then which is the suspension, you're paying another 18,000 over that. And then if you want all the fancy electronics, that's another 22,000 over that. So effectively, this bike, as we have tested it, costs Rs 3.04 lakh ex-showroom. That is a lot of money, but that is also a lot of tech. So it does have a fair bit of rivals as well. You have the Time Speed 400, you have the KTM Duke 390, and you also have the new 390 Duke coming up very soon. So it's not like this stands alone in the segment. This has a fair bunch of rivals that do different things. So it really boils down to what you want from your bike. If you want something that is fun for the city, fun for the occasional track day, and a bit of touring, not too much, then this does seem like a good option. But whether or not you'll be willing to pay that price tag for it, let me know in the comment section down below. I'm really keen on hearing what you have to say about it. In the meantime, thanks for watching.